There was a generation that did not know the Lord, not what he had done. That is taken from Judges chapter 2, verse 10. And I want you to let that sink in. This was not a pagan nation. They were not people who had never heard about God. These were children of who we might call believers. They had history, they had stories, they had access. Yet somehow they lost God. And the question that, reading that makes me ask myself, but also wonder is, are we watching that happen yet again right now? And how am I making sure that that's not the testimony that I leave behind? So let's be honest, we are dealing with a cultural shift. We're also experiencing a spiritual drift, and this has been happening for a while now. But even especially in places like Canada where I live, we have seen the trend that church attendance is declining. Young adults are leaving the faith in large numbers at that. People who are currently adults would often tell you they were raised in church, they grew up in church, but then you see a lot of them not in church anymore, and they're raising children, right? And many who grew up in church, many of these people also no longer identify as Christians. And even if they do, you sometimes look at what the Bible tells us a Christian is supposed to be, and it feels as though, right? And this is not as though it doesn't align with some of the things we see them do. And this is not to make anybody feel bad or to judge anybody. Quite frankly, that is not what this is about, right? But nor is it about making anybody scared. But what I want to highlight here is that most of these people don't even leave because they hated God. They don't even leave because, some of these things didn't really make sense in and of themselves per se. But many of them, honestly, when it comes down to it, many truly leave because they never really knew God. And here's why. Because there's a difference between knowing about God, hearing about God in that sense, and actually getting to know God intimately. And also getting to really walk with God and experience God for themselves, where God no longer just becomes the God of your father or the God of your mother, but becomes your God. That's one reason why they leave. And for some others, they leave because they've seen people whose lives did not measure up with what they professed to believe. And that's a very, very, very big one. Right, that's a very big one. And when we're talking about how to correct this, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, right? So, and somewhere between one generation and the next, that connection breaks. Okay, and when it breaks, the issue is that we then have a whole new generation who rise up and they leave you wondering where the values they were raised on, where is the God that their fathers and mothers walked with, right? So, and that's what we're going to be talking about. And this is not new, right? It is not a new thing. In the Bible, we see this happen with God's own people, right? And so what you see in the scripture that we read at the beginning, Joshua chapter 2, it's not just history. It is a pattern. We see this happen again and again, right? As a matter of fact, let's read that again. It says that after that whole generation, and that's the generation of Joshua and the people who were in the wilderness with Joshua, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord, nor what he had done for Israel. Now notice this, all it took was one generation. Not 10, not centuries. One generation, and God was already forgotten. Why? It was a question I had to ask myself. How do we get there? How did we get there? How did they get there? Right? And that's because the answer really simply is that legacy was not sustained. These people did not live with a legacy mindset. And you know what's even more painful is that God not just warned them about this happening, right? It says in Deuteronomy chapter 6, said to them, he said, be careful that you do not forget the Lord. He also gave them a template on how exactly to ensure that they passed this thing from one generation to another. It said in Deuteronomy 4:9, and he also iterated this a lot in Deuteronomy 6 and other parts of the Bible. It said, teach them to your children, right? Deuteronomy 4:9 actually even specifically says, teach them to your children and to their children after them. So it's not even just your children. We see a lot of parents and grandparents these days who take it upon themselves to pass on a legacy of faith to their grandchildren, especially for those who have the opportunity to still be in their children's lives, who have the opportunity to be in their grandchildren's lives, and they have all the time to miss them are retirees quite often too, right? And so they take that time and they channel it into making sure that their grandchildren have that legacy of faith, or at the very least have the foundation of it. And see, God knew that this, if not intentionally passed down, if faith is not intentionally passed down, it will be accidentally lost. And that will be a shame, because we're going to have to give account of what it is that we did with the faith that was put in our hands. Okay, so the question then becomes, how do we get there? How does this happen? Because I've also seen this in my own life and in my family, where you see a family and you see a generation that served God, that loved God, and then you see that sometimes the next generation comes in and they just go off. Why? They just go off. I saw this happen with my grandparents. Actually, there was a church that used to run in our household. My grandparents were leaders of that church. My family, the story and the history of our family has been told, or I've been told, and I've been, and it's true, right? My family brought the Anglican church, where my family is Anglican, and I don't go to Anglican anymore. But my family had brought the Anglican church to my village in River State, and until date, we're a very highly respected family in the Anglican church in that village and in the States as well. But I would never have known nor appreciated certain things about my family, my family's heritage, the role we played even in stopping the killing of twins in my village, right? If nobody had ever told me about the history of that. And I believe very strongly that that's one of the ways that a generation can forget God, when the children are not told. Because like I said, God gave them a template. Tell them to your children, teach them to your children, right? And so, because no generation would wake up one day and just say that they don't want God. It happens subtly sometimes, and at other times it happens also because of hurt. And don't get me wrong, there are times that you can do everything right to raise a child in the way of faith, and they may still make a choice to go. But here's one thing that I know, and I wish that I had the statistics to show you on this. But even just think about a lot of people who were raised in church, who were raised with certain values. They may, at the beginning or at some points in their lives, even if they don't fully embrace the idea of faith and God and itself, but you'll see that the way they live their lives are still guided by the values that come out of that experience, that come out of that teaching. And so it's no wonder when Proverbs 22:6 tells us that train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart. They may stray sometimes, but they will not depart. And there are many cases of people who often would have started out walking in God, or raised in church, raised in God, right? Because it's not just about church as in the building itself or a denomination. There are many people who are raised in God, and then they grow up, they make a decision to not serve that God. But at some points in their lives, and we're seeing this starting to happen even gradually around the society as well, is that something begins to tug at their hearts, and guess what? They come back. Right? Those are the people who eventually they may never depart. And there are some who sometimes will feel like they're way too far gone to return the shame, the guilt of it. And that's why even as a church, we need to keep our doors and our hearts open, so that when those people, the prodigals, when they come back, that they receive nothing but love, and then they can be rediscipled back and grown. And so there is that piece, and I wanted to just add that in there as well, that sometimes it's that we did everything right in that sense, but people still stray, people still go off the path. And in that instance, God will tell you that he's not going to demand their blood on your hands. You see, because if I tell someone who is in sin that they're going to die and you don't tell them, then what will happen is that if they die in their sin, I will demand their blood on your hands, from your hands. But if you tell them, and that includes our children, if you tell them and then they still choose to go otherwise, because there would always be that place of choice. If they still choose to go otherwise, then in that instance, God is not going to hold anything against you. All right, so let's go back to the question, how does a generation forget God? Number one is that faith becomes information and not transformation. We tell children Bible stories. We tell them all the things. They know Bible stories, but they don't ever really get to, most of these people don't ever get to really experience God for themselves personally. Right? Matthew 15:8 says that these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. When a generation has not experienced God for themselves personally, the truth is that all they have is just information about scripture, information about God, but it hasn't entered into their hearts. One of the prayers I personally pray for my children over and over and over and over is, God, may they know you for you. One story that I love so much is the story of Jacob in Genesis. And one of the things that had happened is that if you notice the story of Jacob, he starts out always talking about the God of his father, Isaac and Abraham, the God of his father, Isaac and Abraham. But then we come to a point in time where Jacob has an encounter with God. And the conversation shifts from the God of my fathers to my God. And so there is information. He walked at first with that information, right? But then a moment comes where he gets to experience this God personally. And at that point, from that point on, there is nothing you can tell him. That's when conviction has entered. And it stops being your God or your father's God or your mother's God, and it becomes their God. So how are we making sure that we are passing information? We're not just passing information, but that there's transformation that is happening in the lives of these children. Number two way that a generation can forget God is that parents and leaders stop being intentional. We say things like, oh, they'll figure it out, or they are too young. They are never too young. One thing I always tell about, by the way, I teach teens in my church. And one thing I always tell the teenagers is, if you are not too young for the devil to come after you, you are not too young for God to use you. So make yourselves available to God. And the other thing too I also do is that I do not assume they know. And I will never assume that because they are being raised in church that they have had an encounter with God that brings about conviction of sin and brings about the transformations in their hearts. And so there is nothing like they'll figure it out. There is nothing like, they're too young. Scripture tells us in Deuteronomy 6:7, it says to impress them upon your children. Impress them on your children. There are other faiths that they this thing is called doctrine. We call it doctrine. How do you teach doctrine? The process of teaching doctrine is called what? Indoctrination. Other faiths do it. But then the moment you tell Christians, indoctrinate your children with your values and what you believe, all of a sudden it feels like, we are fanatics. You are not a fanatic. The process of teaching doctrine is called indoctrination. Is that you are passing down a way of doing things, the tenets of what makes the tenets and the elements within that faith is what you're passing down. Why it has to be a certain way. Other faiths will do it. They will teach them. They will have them memorize. They will have them sit down and meditate. And then Christians will say that, no, they are too young. It's too much work. And we permit everything. We have to be deliberate in transferring this thing if we want a continuity. When I tell people oftentimes that when I was young, by the age of six, and I know this because I went to live with a different auntie, one of my family members at the age of 6. But before that time, I could memorize by heart Psalm 46, Psalm 51, Psalm 23, Psalm 24, Psalm 27, Psalm 121, Psalm 51, if I've not mentioned that before. And then there were smaller verses and scriptures here and there. Exodus 14:14, John 15:5. Matthew 6, the Lord's Prayer. There were a couple scriptures. Obviously, everybody knows Jesus wept, and then John 3:16. By age 6, I do remember I knew all of these verses, chapters already. Because my grandfather would not have it. Every night, we must sit down, you will memorize them. At that age. But guess what? It still bore fruit. Did I stray? Oh yes. At some point, I was a self-acclaimed atheist. But look where we are today. Intentionality. Number 3, why a generation forgets God, we outsource discipleship. Church becomes a weekly event, not a daily lifestyle. God designed the home, and this is where parents especially come in. The home is the first place of discipleship. Nobody's going to do it for you. And no, it is not just something that mothers do. It is not just something that mothers do. It is something that fathers and mothers will do together. Malachi chapter 2, and I love this verse a lot. You begin to read, and then you get to from verse 13 all the way to about 16 or 15, and then God talks to them about how they are burning his altar with their tears, but then he's not having it. Why? He talks about the fact that the husband, and he was talking to the husbands, that you are burning it. Is that because you have dealt wickedly with the wife of your youth? You have cast her aside. You have divorced her. And he says, I hate divorce. He said, is this not the reason that I brought you two together? Why? To do what? To raise me a godly seed. That's in the home. He didn't talk about it for the priest to do at the temple. That was not what it was. We see Moses. One of the things that helped Moses understand his place as an Israelite, even though he was in Egypt and raised in the palace of Egypt, was why? Because he had a mother who was raising him. The Pharaoh's daughter didn't know that she was raising. The person she brought to help her raise her son Moses was actually his biological mother. And so while she was there, she took advantage and she discipled him in that place. And little wonder that by the time he grew up, he knew who he was, even though he was a prince of Egypt. And the Bible says when the time came that he was not ashamed to identify with the people of God, rather than be called the son of Pharaoh. The home is the first place of discipleship. Fathers need to wake up. Mothers need to wake up. Even aunties and uncles, there's a research that shows that as children begin to get into ages 12 and above, they tend to, the voices of parents weaken. But you know what gives strength to it? It's the voices of other trusted adults around them. Who are you surrounding your children with? Who are your friends? Can you trust that if you're not able to get through to your child, you can send that child to your friend, to an auntie, to an uncle, and they will be able to disciple them on your behalf? Do you have those kinds of people? But whatever the case is, it starts from home. We say this thing, charity begins at home, but so does discipleship. Number 4 is that we model success, but we never model faith. A lot of times, children will see your career successes. They will see your money. We even go as far as writing down wills, how to distribute the money, how to do all of that. They'll see the achievements. We'll put them on social media. If they're old enough to be on it, we're tagging them, they're tagging us. But do they also see you model prayer? Do they see you model faith? Do they see you depend on God? And depending on God and doing all of these things is not enough. Are you telling them about it? Are they aware? Do they hear the stories? We tell them stories of our growing up, what it was like, what our parents did, how we trekked and walked 12 kilometers and 12 miles. And crossed 7 hills and 7 seas and climbed 7 mountains to get to school. But do they also hear about how, when there was no provision, how God showed up? Do they hear about when they were sick and doctors didn't know what to do, and all you had left was a prayer, you prayed for them and you watched them get healed? Do they hear about the stories of those things? For many of us as Africans and as Nigerians, we don't just name names. I was sharing with them earlier with someone, and I said, people think that we planned, my kids' names are Simi and Simi, or the short form of it. People think we planned it. But if you know what was going on, you will know that we could never have been going through what we're going through, that it ended up reflecting in the names we gave to our children. You can't be going through that and be planning out to rhyme names. That was pure coincidence. We didn't even occur to us until we named the second one and started calling him a short form. That was when we realized, oh, they actually, Simi Timi. But one is Adesimisola. Ask your Yoruba person to tell you. And the other is Adetimilain. The Ade, by the way, was added by, the Yoruba people. My husband's family. Right? Me, I knew the Simisola and then I knew the Timilain. And here's what it was. The states we're in fact, by the meaning of the name, Simisola means that this is someone who rests in wealth. Timilain means, that's, someone has my back. But that someone obviously there in our minds is that God. We rest in the wealth of God. This child is resting in wealth. There were things going on. We didn't have, there is no way we're thinking names rhyming. And we tell them these things so that they will understand. So that you can be proud of your name. You can be proud of the journey, of the story. And how you got here. One of the things that gives me so much joy, I heard stories about how my great-great-grandmother, I think, was someone in my lineage. And I'm actually named after that woman. How she sustained the lives of her twins. They were going to kill them because that was the culture. That was the tradition. And I like to see, she pulled an Elijah on them. She pulled an Elijah versus a Baal on them. And said, give me time. If this thing that is plaguing this village does not reverse, then you can have my twins and kill them. But if it does, you people are going to serve God. That's how the Anglican Church got to my village. Because a woman stood and said, I will not. But then here's the thing. Because someone passed that story down to us, and she made a covenant and said, if God, you save me and deliver my children for the rest of this earth, you will always find someone in my lineage to serve you. Until today. I don't know what generation I am after her. I think I'm like, 6, 7, I'm not sure. 5, I'm not sure, really. But at least it is at least, because I have my grandfather passed just a few years ago during the COVID years. And so how many generations passed now? And I am proud to tell you that even in my own generation, there are people who are serving God by his grace fervently. In fact, so far, I think almost all of us in my generation. And by God's grace, I have now made the same covenant with God to say it continues. And when I gave my life to Christ and I started understanding, and look at the covenant she made, even if I wanted to completely go astray, I could not. But all the other things still were elements that were added to it to ensure that legacy continued. But someone told me, and now that I have that relationship with God, sometimes when I forget, when I get discouraged, I use those stories to remind myself, to say with everything she went through, if she didn't give up, where would I? So we model the success. We tell them the things we did. We teach them the strategies. Do you teach them the strategy of prayer? Do you teach them the strategy of faith? Do you teach them the strategy of the word? But more importantly, do they see you do it? Because you can tell them to do those things all you want. If you don't do it, chances are they will not do it at all. Because gone are the days where we tell kids, do as I say, but not as I do. Number 5 is that culture becomes louder than the truth. Social media, entertainment, ideologies, and boy, do we have more than enough of that going around these days. And these things are discipling our children faster than we are. That includes even schools. If you live in the Western world, you know how many policies and issues people are battling to fight for the lives of their children and the future and the faith that we all believe in. And if we are not intentional, culture just might erase the next generation. But God forbid. And that's why I like the song that, talks about the fact that we will shift the culture. We have to shift the culture. We don't have a choice. So what are the consequences? Because these things have a consequence. What are some of the consequences of a lost legacy? When legacy is broken, identity can be lost. And we see that happening today in our world. And they'll tell you that it's because, people didn't accept certain people. That's why they are committing suicides and all of that. No, they are trying to figure things out. They are trying to figure themselves out. There are no value systems that are guiding people anymore. No sound values. And when you don't have sound values, what happens is people begin to have identity crisis. And we are seeing that happening in our world today. Purpose becomes unclear. We know the saying, when the purpose of a thing is unknown, what? Abuse is inevitable. Look around you. How much of that do you see? People don't know why they were created girls anymore. People don't know why they were created boys. They want to swap. They want a shift. And then truth becomes relative. I can be whoever or whatever I am. No, you cannot just be whatever or whoever you are. Nines cannot suddenly decide that it just wants to be day and stay day forever. We'll all be in trouble. Gravity cannot just decide that it does not want to be gravity anymore. We'll be in trouble. The sun cannot just decide that it doesn't want to stay up there anymore. It wants to come down. Picture that. So if anybody and anything can be anything, really, what are we doing? And all of these things are consequences of legacies that we have lost. Legacies of faith. And then ultimately, God becomes distant. And then you see in that Judges chapter 2, the next verse there after 10 and 11 tells us that then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Why? God is distant. Legacy lost. Because when God is forgotten, everything else will begin to collapse. Again, look around you. But then this is not just about the people in the Bible, because like I said before, a pattern is repeating itself. It's about us, because we're not going to point fingers at the society, at schools, at governments, and all of that. The real question then will be, what are we ourselves passing down? What are we passing down? Because legacy is not automatic. If it's not built, then I can assure you that it's been neglected. Are you building legacy? So the real challenge here is that if we don't change, I want us all to sit, reflect. Because if we don't change and we ask ourselves the question, if nothing changes, what do we think will happen? Will the next generation know God? Or will it be said of our own time that a generation arose that did not know the Lord? I really hope not. But there's good news. The story can change. We can break the cycle. Legacy can be built or rebuilt, even if it's lost. All right. And so we're going to pause here for today. If this has stirred something in you, I want you to share this with someone, especially someone who cares about the next generation. And that better be everybody around you. All right. And number 2, I want you to start asking yourself, who am I raising? Because it's not even just about biological children. And I want you to prepare for part 2, because we are not done with this message. Because next, we're going to go deeper and we're going to look at what spiritual legacy really is. And we're going to also look at the elements that make it strong. All right? We're going to look at the elements that make it strong. I just don't want to have to, drop a lot right now today. For now, we're going to leave it there. Now, I want you to remember that legacy is not just what you leave behind. You can leave something behind. But then the question is, how much of it will continue to live on when you're gone? I'll see you in the next video.